Hi, my name is Torri Wright, and I'm one of the founders here at BEHCA, and I would like to present some best practices for collecting behavioral data, specifically in correlation with goals around behavior plans, IEP goals, and so forth for the folks that you might support in the intellectual disability or neurodiverse communities, as well as challenging and complex behaviors. All right, let's get started. So my name is Tori, as I mentioned. I'm one of the founders, and we created this app to solve the issue that I saw as a special education teacher, as well as a behavior professional, which is the meaningful collection of data that actually informs the functions of data, as well as the influencing variables, and further testing to see if the interventions we are putting in place are effective. We have added a lot of things to BEHCA over the years, and I will go over a few of those things. But first, let's dive into what are the best practices around collecting data, whether you use BEHCA or not. First of all, why do we collect data? It helps us allow our staff and ourselves to look beyond my personal experience and really look at the world and the environment from the person that I'm supporting from their point of view more effectively. It also helps us collect baseline data. So when I say baseline data, I am referring to frequency, duration, and intensity. Another way of saying that is frequency is how often does it happen? Duration is how long does it happen? And the intensity is what is the direct result? Did it cause harm? Was there property damage? Was there bruising? Did somebody have to go to the hospital? That's the severity and intensity. And when we collect that baseline data in a format that is more frequently collected, it actually amplifies our picture into what is going on in terms of that baseline. Having baseline data is incredibly important for those of us who are writing those plans or developing plans that really we're trying to look for interventions that will support the individual to reduce all of those baseline data points. So this also allows us to look at the evidence-based data that test for the efficacy of interventions. And I'll dive more into that in each of these sections, as well as looking at what are the daily living goals. That might include social, it might include independent goals, maybe even academic if that's appropriate. And over time, a longer period of time, we want to look at trends and patterns. This is really important when we have individuals that we suspect and we anecdotally notice that they struggle during larger transitions, during holidays or specific times of the year, and we're not entirely sure how long that is or exactly what those trends are. This is also really important for those trends, for those folks who we kind of suspect and anecdotally see that they have like 3 weeks of good times and things are rocking and rolling, and then it seems like they fall off for a couple of weeks, no matter what we're doing in terms of the intervention. So it really allows us to dive in and really look at a bigger picture. So if you can imagine having data for an entire year where you're collecting this information, boy, the way that we could make decisions from that perspective really broadens the picture of supporting the individuals. And then finally, I want to talk about specifically within foster homes, group homes, agencies, residential, there are requirements for us to track medication administration records as well as incident reports. And we have added these features to BEHCA because we recognize, for one, this is a requirement, oftentimes from government officials, as well as it helps us line up our data points in comparison to those pieces of data. So when a person has a change in medication, behavior is likely going to either decrease or increase, or new behaviors might happen. And if we are not collecting data in conjunction or parallel to those medication changes, we might miss that. And we might sort of assume that those medication side effects have to do with something totally different. And that's a really important thing to look at. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so let's talk about data. in terms of once we have this data, why is it so important? Well, it tells a story. It also helps inform us of what is working and what is not, as well as it's an amazing talking point for staff to be able to come together and say, I'm noticing A, B, or C, or hey, Susie, I'm noticing that you're tracking a lot of the challenging behavior, but maybe you're missing the warning behavior. Can I help you with this? So it also allows us to be able to have conversations around support that remove those emotional tensions. Instead, we're literally looking at data points, which are measurable and observable and factually, we hope, input. So this is actually a graph that you would see on BEHCA. You'll notice that the top two are frequency and duration, and the yellow is warning signs, and the red are the challenging behavior. And this is wonderful because it allows those of us who write plans to be able to quickly identify, oh, you know what, they had in this date range that I'm looking at, say I'm looking at 3 months, in 3 months, there were 19 times that they were screaming, and it lasted approximately 19 minutes each time. The average minute was 19 times. So it kind of helps us be able to identify that very quickly. And then we can have a reporting, plus we can print out this sheet as a PDF and attach it to our reports just so then people can look at it. And then the middle section is a graph that we've designed for you to be really interactive and get down into the details of what is influencing the behavior and kind of those trends that we were talking about earlier. And then, of course, we look at the desired behavior. This is where we're tracking our goals, our outcomes of our goals. That's something that I notice that we don't really look at very often is, are we meeting our goals? Or are we just carrying goals over from one planning period to another, or from one year to another as we're developing these plans? My experience is that's what we often do. We didn't really quite meet that goal. We're still working on it. So we're going to carry it over. And then it's 3 years later and we're asking ourselves, gosh, should we even continue working on this goal because we haven't developed any further skills around it? So it really helps us look to see like how effective are the interventions that are really meant to support the goal development and the skill development, as well as to test to see like how are those skills developing over time? Is there a slow trend happening? That's great if there's any kind of growth set. Now we just need to adjust the environment and our supports around that to continue to increase that growth. And then finally, just looking at the warning signs versus intervention tracking. This is really more looking at specifically staff where we are collecting warning signs. And if you are tracking warning signs and you're pressing that plus sign, for those of you who use BEHCA, when you're entering that data and you're tracking those warning signs, what are you doing to support that? There should be a follow-up with what intervention did you provide? Okay, so some best practice considerations. First, we want to pay attention to witnessing the individual, being empathic, collecting data points that are measurable and observable. We want to, of course, test the interventions that we have implemented to make sure that they're effective. We also want to see how self-aware and accountable are we being as the staff or support person. And then influencing variables. These are outside things that influence or add to the behavior that we are trying to support. Then building the hypothesis, or another way of putting that is building the story around what that person is experiencing. And then finally, looking at our initial thoughts and biases, opinions, or judgments. Okay, when we talk about witnessing an individual, this is where I would go in and do what we might call an observation, but I am not there to assess, I'm not there to evaluate or to judge in any capacity. In fact, if I were a staff, I might just sit back and be interacting with the individual or just kind of chilling and paying attention to how the person that I am witnessing is interacting with others, how they are interacting with the environment around them. I won't be taking notes. This is a 5 minute, maybe 2 times a day for a little while. Why this is so important is because when we first start tracking data in BEHCA, we want to have a really solid understanding of what are the influencing variables, as well as specifically what are the warning signs that this person is telling us. And I'm going to talk about warning signs in a little bit, but those warning signs are kind of our golden information. And if we don't have those really clearly written down, documented, and a part of our data tracking, we are not probably going to be very successful with our interventions. And so this also allows us when we're training new staff or when we are bringing in new individuals, when we take that time to witness the person, we gain a lot of insight from this. And the reason I say that we need to be free of notes, free of assessment, free of judgment, is because we really look at the situation from a different perspective, and we might actually pick up on things that otherwise we don't. Because the reality is that when we go in with our notepads or our assessments, what ends up happening is we kind of put on the subconscious hat of I'm evaluating. And if I'm evaluating, psychologically, I'm going to look for validation of what I already know about this person. I am going to maybe even have some bias or some judgments. Whereas if I go in and I'm just like, you know what, I am just going to see how this person interacts with the world around them, it's a completely different experience. And the amount of information is going to be much more powerful than the latter part of that. And then as you do this for a little while, my recommendation is to do this 2 times a day, 5 minutes a day, or 5 minutes each time, and have a couple of different staff doing this, and then writing your notes later and kind of documenting a little bit about it later. But ultimately, when you have that for maybe say 2 weeks that you're doing this, and it doesn't have to be every day or exact, but when you have 2 weeks of this by a few different staff, you are going to learn a lot about that individual. Even if you already know this person, you might learn some new things because it's really asking us to be non-biased and to remove those assessments or those assumptions that we already have, to just witness with the intention of learning something new about that individual. Okay, and this leads me to empathy. Empathy is so critically important in this field. First of all, I'm not just talking about being mindful of the fact that the individual that you're supporting struggles with a lot of things throughout their day, whether it's social skills or daily living skills or cognitive processing, whatever it is, that we of course want to have empathy. But even beyond that, having empathy for an individual with the idea of knowing that when I witness this person, they are likely experiencing the world from a very different perspective than I am. So I am going to pay attention to their social interactions, their sensory interactions, even how they're kind of processing and interacting from a communication, as well as how do they problem solve, how do they engage. And if I know anything biologically or socioeconomic or cultural, those things are kind of secondary from my perspective because we may or may not have all of that information. But the sensory, the social, and cognitive, those pieces of information are really critical, because one observation that I've had throughout 26 years of being in this field is that we often as human beings show up and make assumptions unintentionally that the person is having a more similar experience to our experiences, like our lived experiences, than than they really are. So what that means is my brain, my nervous system, my brain is going to walk in. And if I'm watching somebody, I am trying to inherently, like our nervous system, our brain does this automatically. I'm trying to look for similarities and validation of what I already think I know. What empathy is really asking us in these spaces specifically is to kind of step back through that witnessing window and to really look at, is this person experiencing something different from a sensory perspective than I experience? Is this person processing? Of course, they're going to be processing different than I am. And as well as social, do they really enjoy socially connecting? And we've kind of missed that. Or maybe they're struggling, but they have a tendency to kind of isolate. And it's not because they're introverted, but actually they just feel shut down or insecure about that. So really paying attention to why are they showing up the way that they are, and getting curious about those components. So then that leads us to measurable and observable. These are going to be things that are factual and uses the language that is fact-based as well, which that automatically reduces any kind of emotional trigger. So fact-based language, of course, it supports more trauma-informed practices. It also acknowledges that the behavior is more of an extension of communication rather than something that they're doing on purpose or that it's a personal attack on us. Because let's face it, when we're in these really challenging situations, it's very hard not to take it personal. It's very hard not to personalize it because that's a human reaction. The subjective language, it limits our ability to build a connection and a meaningful relationship or trust. They're not going to trust us. If I'm taking things personally, that individual is going to see that I don't feel secure with them and that I'm not actually confident when I show up. And so now we're going to constantly have this like shaky connection, this shaky relationship, and it's not going to build that trust that we need for those difficult situations for them to trust us that we're going to keep them safe. So those opinion-based descriptions are biased and unclear. They also inflate our tension among staff and the person that we support. So sometimes what I mean by that is I can say, Susie's just really difficult to work with because she's always swearing at me and, she talks about my mom all the time and it's just so inappropriate. And if I'm saying this to another staff, first of all, I'm now verbally saying these things and I'm now also influencing the opinion or that thought of another staff member, which can be a little bit tricky. So that's something to just kind of keep in mind in terms of our bias. And then, of course, this kind of approach, I would say, is very old. Like it's been around forever. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, I've been in this field for 26 plus years now. And honestly, um, I can say that most teams that I've been on, it's really easy to get in that state of talking about individuals in a really challenging or complex way, as if it's a personal thing. And so that feels, when we talk like that, it's actually more supportive of us than it really is about the individual. So again, we're unintentionally making it about us. So that's just something to kind of consider as we're moving forward. And I always say measurable and observable. It's something that I can clearly state. So some examples of that would be hood overhead. Clearly the hood is over the head. Arms are crossed. The fists are clenched. Scrunched face. Like these are things that if I say them, you can visualize and know exactly what that is. Some of those subjective things that I often see in T-logs or progress monitoring notes or even on incident reports is he was rude to me. They used inappropriate language. There was refusal or made threats. Like, what were the threats? What did that mean? Did it say, I'm going to rip that string off of your shirt? Was it, I'm going to knock that pen off the desk? Versus, I'm going to kill you. Those are very different things. So we need to make sure that we're really specific in what is actually happening. And then those refusals, what did they refuse? Because, and the reason why, instead of just saying refusal, because I see that a lot of times on documentation, the reason why just writing refusal is a difficult thing, because if we don't document exactly what they were refusing, then we don't know how to change it. We don't know how to modify it. Because oftentimes when folks refuse, there's an absolute reason. Because remember, behavior is just an extension of their communication. So a refusal is basically saying no, or I'm really upset with you and I don't want to do anything because that feels like the only thing I have control over. And the refusal sometimes feels like it's a personal thing, or one thing that I've heard a lot, and I'm not going to say this doesn't happen because I do know that there's patterns of behavior that have been developed, but like a refusal to go on an outing because it has an impact on everybody else. Why? What is that really about? And so that's part of what I'm trying to offer here is really stepping way back. And if I don't take something personal, what do I learn from that behavior? If I am not busy thinking about how this is affecting me on a personal level, then what can I learn by really paying attention to what led up to that behavior? Why did they choose that behavior? And what are they getting out of it? And then, of course, like angry, aggressive, out of control, throwing a fit, none of those things, those are what I call subjective. Out of control to you might be very different than out of control to me. Throwing a fit to you versus to me, very subjective. It could mean one thing to one person and something totally different to another person. So making sure that we're really specific with those fact-based languages. Okay, then once we have those influencing variables and we know the warning signs, we then get to test our interventions. Are the interventions working? And I know I haven't gotten to the warning signs yet, but this will continue to make more and more sense as we go. Testing interventions is so critically important. And that's another thing that I constantly saw missing from our data. Oftentimes when I see data, it's typically pen and paper, if if we're lucky, if we're even getting that. And even on the pen and paper, we are really just tracking those challenging behaviors and maybe the intervention and possibly the effectiveness of it. But that's really hard to track on pen and paper or even in clunky Google Sheets. I know that there are some people that are really phenomenal at like creating these really fancy Excel sheets. In fact, that was me. When I was a special education teacher, I became an Excel queen. I had no idea that I was so good at that. But I was really determined because I recognized that the more data we had, the more data points we had, and the more frequent we could get those data points, the more I really learned what those patterns and trends were with my students at that time. And that was really important for me to know because it allowed me to adjust the way I was approaching them. My interventions completely changed based on the information that I was gaining over time. And that brings me to, are the interventions being provided at a relevant or meaningful time? So this is where we're going to move into those warning signs. Are staff waiting until the person is actually dysregulated or in crisis? Well, that won't ever work. If we're waiting until they're like just before crisis or already in crisis, it's never going to work. Those interventions are going to appear to be very ineffective, or they're going to refuse access to those or implementation of those interventions because really they're in a crisis situation. And our job at that point is to be handling the crisis. And then finally, do the staff even know the warning signs? So that's where that witnessing and making sure that we're kind of looking at these things from a different point of view is so important. And the final one here is actually have those interventions run their course. I can tell you from reading a lot of reports and document like ISPs or IEPs or behavior plans and so forth, my observation is that sometimes those interventions are carried over from one report to another, and there really isn't any follow-up of how effective it's been. And so that is really something that's super important to test. If this is an intervention that has been around for 5 years, but they're really not engaging, maybe it's time to take it off the list. Okay, so let's talk about those warning signs versus crisis. Those warning signs are going to be, in fact, it's the example that I showed earlier of like the hood over the head, pacing, those things. They're subtle changes in behavior. They're typically not loud enough or invasive enough to get the attention right away. They're often overlooked because as staff, we tend to be really busy. We tend to be a little bit distracted. And so when that happens, we have a tendency to really wait, not on purpose, but subconsciously, we wait until they are just before crisis because now the behavior is starting to get louder. Now it's starting to really escalate. I think a great example of this was there was a family that I supported one time, and the mom had told me, oh, my son goes from 0 to 60. And then by the time he's at 60 and it's like no warning whatsoever, he's like punching holes in the walls and screaming and all these things. And I'm like, wow, okay, let's talk about this. And I was at the house. And during this time, her son had actually asked his mom a question 4 different times, and she completely didn't hear him. And I started to realize that, wow, I think this mom actually might have maybe ADHD or she's just kind of learned to tune it out. I'm not really sure. But it was on the 5th time that the child started to actually increase their volume and the level of intensity, as well as he then started to get closer in proximity to his mom after the 5th, the 6th, the 7th time. And then he really was escalated. And that was actually really fascinating because the mom was like, see, there was no warning. And I was like, let's talk about that. So I think sometimes we have a tendency, especially when we worked with people over time, to kind of tune those things out and really minimize paying attention to those warning signs. So just paying attention to the subtle changes of behavior. This is literally that golden information. If I can pay attention to those warning signs, that's my number one cue to make sure that I'm providing an intervention to help them regulate so that they avoid getting to crisis or dysregulation. And this is a much deeper dive in terms of a class of like supporting around this. But essentially, when there are things that are happening throughout the day, it increases that level of those behaviors in terms of intensity. So we want to make sure that we're getting it before it's about ready to overflow. So crisis and dysregulation, I already mentioned this, when somebody is in that state, that is not a time that we can effectively provide an intervention. This is when they are no longer hearing you because of physiological changes. In fact, there's a muscle in your ear that drops down, the facial muscles start to fall flat, eyes might even become dilated. You'll notice a lot of physiological changes with the individual. Their cognitive connection and thinking and rational problem-solving brain is no longer available to be able to hear or interact. In fact, they're going to misread your cues, most likely. And so if we are trying to talk and we're trying to provide these interventions, it actually is going to create a higher level of dysregulation for the individual. So the best thing is, if we notice, oh, shoot, I've missed those warning signs and this person is really in crisis, it's time to just get really quiet and be supportive, validate their experience, and track it as you can. Because what's happening for them is that amygdala has been activated. That amygdala, by the way, otherwise known as the survival brain, it's just a part of the brain that puts you in that fight or flight. And it actually shuts down that front portion of your brain. Okay, so remember, warning signs are really that golden piece, and that's when we want to provide that intervention. If we don't get that intervention, or if we don't get those warning signs, the intervention is not going to be effective. We can still redirect and interact with them at that point, but that managing crisis, as I had mentioned before, that's really giving a lot more space, proximity, paying attention, validation, as I mentioned before, and our co-regulation skills. And again, some of these things are perhaps things that you maybe haven't heard. So I would encourage you to speak to your managers or supervisors about them. And I also have other classes on these if that is an effective thing that or something that you want to learn more about. But the important part here is that you do learn what co-regulation is from some level of capacity, because as direct support staff, our number one job is to co-regulate. And part of that is validating the person's experience. And the only way we can validate a person's experience effectively is if we really remove ourselves from the equation, which means I have to work very hard to not take things personally, as we talked about earlier. And this brings us to self-awareness and self-accountability. The behavior is really not about you, no matter how much we want to think it is, no matter how much that person is really targeting us on a personal level, no matter how much they know about us personally and are bringing that in. Those are just strategies for them to push our buttons. And really, I see when I have individuals that I'm working with that are really good at pushing those buttons, it's because they feel unsafe with people who they feel connected with. And when they push our buttons, they are trying to validate their experience that all adults or supporting staff are unsafe. So if you can really think about it from that perspective, when somebody's pushing your buttons, they are literally testing to see, are you a safe person? Are you grounded? Are you going to be confident? Are you going to keep them safe in a crisis? Or are you going to become reactive? Are you going to take it personal? Are you going to quickly get into a power struggle? So those are things to really just pay attention to. And by the way, we're human. So all of these things that I'm talking about, it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice to be aware. But if we are not really self-aware and we don't reflect on these things, it is really hard to develop those skills. So just being mindful of that. It is kind of a normal person's response to take it personal. So it is really asking us to maybe not be normal, be above normal, and recognize it's not about us. And then our role for co-regulation, as I mentioned before, this takes a lot of skills. It's really understanding what is your nervous system doing? What do you need to do for yourself? And having a plan for yourself so that you can be regulated. And co-regulation is literally the science behind if somebody is dysregulated and my nervous system stays calm, my calm nervous system can help allow that person to become regulated again. If I stay in a calm place, validate, and I'm quiet, and I'm meeting them where they are, I'm not reactive. I'm not engaging in their crisis, but instead I'm standing back and I'm being very calm. My calm presence has an effect on that individual who is having a crisis. This requires a lot of flexibility in my thinking, flexibility in my approach. It also requires a lot of adjustment on my part. So one thing that I also really suggest is having some level of self-reflection after shifts. What worked well, what didn't, and talk to your colleagues, especially those colleagues that are a little bit more seasoned, those staff that have been around for a while and they seem to have it down. Ask them, what are their strategies? And the data, collecting this data really helps too, because we can go back and look at it and we can look at the story. We can recognize the student has all these different variables going on. It really starts to broaden our perspective. And then it also starts to change the way we're interacting, because all of a sudden it becomes a little bit easier to not take it personal, because we recognize this is just a survival skill of the individual. And we also realize that their nervous system is likely in this very heightened level because of the life that they've lived, because of the things that they've gone through. So really being able to connect with them on a deeper level, because we've been successful at being self-accountable and adjusting so that we can meet them where they are. So let's look at influencing variables. So what I mean by that, this is the health, environment, and history, like past trauma, so forth. When I'm talking about environment and the literal things, it could be weather, lights, noise, crowds, proximity, water, any kind of transitions that are happening. This could be staff changes, schedule changes, visitation with families, or lack of visitation with families. These are all environmental things. So I think of environmental as like everything that's surrounding the individual. We don't always have control over those things, but we do have control over how we support the individual, how we modify the environment, how we modify the interventions or their schedule or sort of sensory access, so on and so forth, depending on how well we know that person. And then health, this is a tricky one because it's much more internal. So sometimes people who have self-injurious behavior or really aggressive behavior might actually be struggling with something that's going on inside. Headaches, migraines, constipation, like several days of constipation, I know can create really increased levels of agitation and physical aggression. Allergies, chronic pain, or illnesses, medication side effects, those are all things to really just keep in mind. And again, if we're tracking this and we're kind of keeping a log of some of these things, we might start to realize that they have more validity in what's influencing the behavior than we realized. And then the historical context, sometimes we have this information, sometimes we don't. I'm going to go on a limb and say that if the person is in any kind of a group home, foster home, or otherwise residential setting outside of their typical home, they have absolutely experienced some kind of trauma, loss and removal, as well as I'm also going to go out on a limb and say, I have yet to work with anybody who is not aware at some level of their deficit and feel some level of frustration, which is a daily trauma, feeling like they don't fit in, feeling like they can't overcome their deficits, or they're always failing at everything. And then, of course, that home life loss of, lack of, or just otherwise really feeling lonely or isolated in this world, that they don't belong. I find that, sometimes the individuals that we are working with, one question that I ask is, what is their purpose? Do they have a purpose? Do they feel like they have a purpose? Because purpose gives us a confidence. It also gives us a sense of belonging and a level of empowerment. If a human being doesn't have a purpose, what is the point of being here? And so that actually can be a very deeply rooted part of some of the most challenging behavior. Just food for thought. So building that hypothesis based on this data, following a couple months of collection of data, we want to review as a team, and we want to check, of course, are we checking those warning signs and interventions? Should be around 50-50. If it's not, ask your team, what can we do differently? How do we adjust this? And it could literally just be making sure that everybody on your team is tracking data effectively, and then checking those durations and frequency trends, so those baseline datas, and then of course our goals. Where are we with our goals? So BEHCA itself stands for behavior, environment, health, comparative analysis. As you may have guessed through this presentation, the reason it stands for all those things is because we are looking at all the variables and we're kind of comparatively analyzing how they influence one another. A couple of things that we've added to BEHCA are MAR and incident reporting. So I had mentioned the medication administration records and then incident reporting. We have some really cool tools that we've added to this. If you're interested, of course, and you're not already working with BEHCA, reach out to us. Otherwise, if you are working with us and you have any questions about how to implement or utilize these things, we absolutely welcome those questions. And if you need support around this, please do. But that medication and incident reporting was added specifically because, of course, this is going to correlate with behavior and those trends and patterns over time. Our goal with collecting this data from a bigger perspective, yes, we want the baseline data. Yes, we want to test our interventions. And yes, we want to look at the influencing variables. But ultimately, the goal is to really shift our perspectives and really seeing that the individual is really showing up the best that they can, and that nothing is really personal. It's just an extension of their communication. And how can we as staff really show up from that perspective and not from this assumption or biased point of view where we can land ourselves in power struggles? Okay, if you have any further questions or need further clarification on any part of this presentation, the functions of BEHCA, how to implement, or if you have feedback, something that you would like to see more of, please feel free to reach out to us at hello@behca.com. I am happy to answer any questions and to support you and your team in any way that we can. I am a strong believer that collaboration only makes us better, and I really do hope that BEHCA, the tool, is bringing shifts in perspective in how we are supporting these individuals in this field. And if I can be that support or that additional resource, please reach out to me. I am happy to take those calls. And then finally, here are a couple of resources that we have. These are just a few of the things that I find really powerful to help shift my perspective as a professional and so forth. So Trying Differently Rather Than Harder, Diane Melvin, she's really amazing. What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, See Beyond Emotions, that's myself. I wrote that book, and that's really diving into the nervous system. Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection, Deb Dana. Mind Sights by Dan Siegel. He's the one who, if any of you are familiar with the lid flipped, where your brainstem and then a crisis happens and the lid flip, that's the science and the example of how our front brain is no longer available. And a recent book that I have added to my list is Making Friends with Monsters by Sandra Rostarola. She was an amazing author that I met, and this book is phenomenal. I highly recommend it. It really talks about just mental health and how our brain kind of processes things. It really lent a different viewpoint on just general those monsters, those voices that we hear in our head, and how we can adjust. Again, if you have any questions and we can be of support, please contact us at hello@behca.com. Thank you.